Patreon has updated some of its terms and conditions. So if you are thinking of subscribing, this won't affect anyone who's already subscribed. Please do so in the browser. This isn't Patreon's fault. This is because of Apple. Apple are now taking a extra 30% cut of the Patreon subscription. So we don't see that money. Patreon doesn't see that money. You're paying extra just to Apple. So if you are an Apple user and you use your iPhone to listen to podcasts, if you're thinking of subscribing, please use the website. That's patreon.com/beneath the skin. Just you can do it on your phone. You can do it on your laptop if you have one. Just use the browser. Don't give Apple unnecessary money. Matt.
Yes.
How much did you pay for your very first tattoo?
That's actually a really good question, and I don't actually remember. It was in my first tattoo was in 2001.
Okay.
And it was in was it in 2001? 2000, not 2001, 2000. And it was in francs, in French francs, like right at the dog end of the franc era.
Mm-hmm.
And it was to an American guy called Jack Mosher. And I don't actually remember how much it cost. Like, that's a really bad thing, isn't it? I have no recollection whatsoever. That was a time when, you know, it was my first proper job in a way, so I actually had money for the first time, and it didn't really matter to me how much it cost. I only got 2 small little stars on my wrist, so yeah, I don't remember. Isn't that bad? It's bad, isn't it? How much was yours?
My first tattoo cost €150. It was the Neon Genesis Evangelion tattoo I have on my arm that has aged terribly, but love it nonetheless.
You've aged beautifully though. You're like a fine wine, Thomas. Better with age.
Yeah, I'm looking like Kurt Russell these days at this stage. I'm wearing true vintage jackets from the 50s, that sort of shit. But I paid €150, which was a lot of money for me at the time. And ever since then, I don't think I've ever really gotten a tattoo that cost more than maybe about £350, which adjusted for exchange rate is €420, roundabout. But that is an incredible prelude to talk about what we're talking about today. You're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything.
Money!
Told through the history of tattooing. I'm one of your co-hosts, Thomas O'Money, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Money Lauder. How are you, Matt?
Dr. Matt Loaded. I mean, I wish.
Dr. Matt Loaded, best-selling author, Dr. Matt Loaded. And before we get into the episode, just want to say
my book cost me money, just in case anyone doesn't realize that's a joke.
Yeah. But a bit of housekeeping. We will be at the Krampus Market in Parliament Tattoo on the 1st of December, up around Finsbury Park. So if you want to come in, there's lots of other booths selling some cool stuff. We're going to do a little talk afterwards. We're going to switch it up where I will be interviewing Matt about his career and his research as if I've never met him before and don't know intimate details of his life. And
we're going to be like Ed Balls and Yvette Cooper, you know, on breakfast telly. We're going to have a very in-depth conversation, pretend we've never met.
So you're going to eat a bacon sandwich really, really weirdly?
That was Miliband.
And just destroy your career?
But, yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, no,
that was Ed Miliband. So that was the other one.
Ed Miliband. They're all the same. But also, as well, we will be selling copies of Matt's new book. You can get it signed. You can come and have a chat. You could buy some merch. And also, a big update, which we only found out about last night. All of you know we have a Patreon, and thank you so much to all of our patrons. If you are one of our patrons, or maybe are curious, Patreon has introduced a new gifting option where you can buy a subscription for either a month, a number of months, or an entire year, and gift it to someone else. So if you are stuck for ideas coming up to Christmas for the present for the tattoo lover in your life, and you've already bought both of Matt's books, you can maybe give someone the gift of knowledge and entertainment and listening to me and Matt talk about clothes. But you can do that on patreon.com/beneath the skin. And we have the gifting option there. There'll also be a link in the description of this episode if that is for you. But with that out of the way...
Books out in the UK on the 28th of November, in the US on the 3rd or the 5th of December, the following week. We'll be selling, if you're a £15 a month patron, you will get a copy. If not, it's 25 quid. To buy one, we will be selling it 25 quid plus postage, signed from beneaththeskinshop.com, starting after the 28th of November. So if you don't fancy subscribing at that level, but you still want to buy a copy of the book, you can do so from there. Otherwise, available in all good bookshops and some shit ones as well, I'd imagine.
Mm-hmm. And with that out of the way, let's come back to talking about money. And this is an episode that me and you have kind of been rolling around in our minds for the past, I'd say about 2 months. Maybe about 2 months ago, me and you had, it was a Friday evening, we were having a conversation about marketing and the tattoo industry, and kind of touched on then the core of tattoo pricing. It's something that I think is more pertinent than ever in the tattoo industry. We've seen people try and keep themselves busy by using different tactics like flash days, using discounted designs, trying to appeal to customers. But a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of people who are into tattoos, a lot of my friends, and a lot of them say that like they just don't have the money right now. And the question kind of comes up that, oh, well, getting tattoos is so expensive right now. But Matt has done the rigorous, data-driven research. He's going to work at Ernst Young now, for which you are famous. He's getting a job at Ernst Young. And we have done comprehensive research into the actual history of tattoo prices.
Well, I have to say, look, this could be more rigorous. And as we'll talk about, the conversion of historical prices to present ones, especially in different currencies, is really, really difficult. So actually, there is definitely more, like, I can definitely do a more kind of serious version of than we're going to talk about now. But what I have got for you is a kind of overview of tattoo pricing, as mentioned, certainly as claimed in the newspapers by tattooers over the last 150 years or so, in the UK and the US, and also in Ireland and Australia. I've got a couple of little bits of data from there. And I have a thesis, which is, as I said, is kind of a tentative one at the moment, but I have a thesis that basically at the bottom end, good tattoos are probably more expensive a little bit than they ever have been. However, at the top end, I think basically tattooing is basically the same price as it was 150 years ago. And it's kind of incredible to me to see that the top end custom stuff like really hasn't changed in price much at all when you account for inflation, with the caveats, as I pointed out. I want to start, Tom, with this great quote. And it sort of is related also to the fact that you were arguing with someone on TikTok today who was once again saying that tattooing was not just for sailors anymore.
Unfortunately, Matt is too old and tired now to carry that torch anymore, so it's down to me to fight with people online about tattooing.
I'm not. I like it on Reddit because I don't have to argue because people just cite me without me having to get involved in the conversation. So I'm about to jump in and someone's linked to something I wrote. But so this is from 1893. So about a decade and a half after the start of the pressure industry in Britain, and it's interview I've got quite a bit of data here just because I've got a lot of articles about him, about Sutherland MacDonald, about whom I've obviously talked about a lot. And it's a great quote from the article. It's almost the beginning, a second or third paragraph of the article. It will be difficult to make a tattoo as popular as a drink because there is a wide difference in their relative prices. So far, it's only been the wealthy and titled who could afford a tattoo. It's useless to commence with the firm resolution that $5 worth of tattooing will do you because it won't. Right, so that's an American newspaper talking about a guy in Britain. And $5. So these conversions, just roughly, I'm using some online conversions. $5 then is about $180 US dollars today. So 150 something, 160 quid. So, small little tattoo, 160 quid. How's that for like parity? Because I think most of the tattoos that I know, certainly London, are charging and also in the US are charging somewhere between $100 and $200 an hour, right?
Mm-hmm. And one thing, I suppose, before we proceed is establishing a couple of ground things. So there's a lot of stuff that influences tattoo pricing. Obviously, one of the most important things is rent. Whether you are a shop owner or you are renting a chair, there is a certain amount of rent that needs to be paid. So that factors into the pricing. There is material pricing. There is also your level of skill and level of, I suppose, artistic flair. I don't really know how to put a name on it. But also there's regional influences as well. Like you have to look at this thing in economics called the purchasing power of the consumer. So how much is the person able to afford to pay? And that is based on local things like what are the average wages in an area. Like you look at something like in London versus in the north of England and somewhere like Manchester or Liverpool, the wages in general are higher. So the customers can afford.
And I've got some
to pay
interesting
more.
examples of that specifically where that is discussed in certain moments in history. And actually, yeah, the point you make, and I'll return to this later on, but there was an article from Andrew Leams's abortive tattoo encyclopedia from the late 70s, which we did a whole episode about, in which, and I'll talk back to this in a bit. But no, but he says even in there, right, due to inflation and devaluation of the dollar, a different picture is presented. Due to increased costs of all equipment, materials, and supplies, it's become necessary for tattooists to raise their prices accordingly, with most studios having a minimum charge for work done, regardless of the size of that work. Inflation is everywhere, and the tattoo shop is no exception. These increases are necessarily reflected in the cost of the tattoo. So even those anxieties that tattooers are having now and talking about prices for everything going up, that was also a concern in the 1970s.
And also as well, something that will more than likely come up when we're talking about both that period and now is the relative increase in the amount of people tattooing as well. Like the amount of tattoo artists around, it's simple supply and demand, while the supply of potential customers has, I suppose, exponentially increased as time has gone on. There's also been a relative increase in the amount of people tattooing.
Right. Yeah, and you see that again. We'll see that as we go through some of these articles. I think so. I want to ask you just firstly, like, what you thought of this idea that right at the beginning or very near the beginning of the professional industry, someone's going, you could get a cheap tattoo, but you'll just want to get bigger and better ones straight away. And actually, this is a rich man's game. Like that was the story about tattooing in the pro era, right at the beginning, right?
Well, when you look at like the history of, I suppose, artisan crafts, when you have a very limited supply of people who are able to do it competently, essentially the artist can dictate the price pretty much. Is like if you are getting an extensive work or you're buying, a high quality copper and it's a Nasir is like in your ear complaining about the quality of your copper, it like the artist then can decide, okay, I am doing, say, like someone like Sutherland McDonald doing like a full chest piece or a full back piece. He's the only one, aside from maybe a handful of other people, depending on what point of his career you pick. You can just name your price pretty much then.
Oh, and we're going to come to someone who does that in the most ballsy way possible. So, okay, let's start with McDonald, because he, as I said, I've got a bit of data on him, and he's really the kind of first, very kind of professionally oriented tattooer in the UK. So he basically said that
and also as well, just again, to jump in, this is in the era where like you were working in your shop, you own the shop, you're not paying like someone who owns the shop a cut of your earnings. This is like handful of artists own where they're working. They might be paying rent for the space, but that's it.
Yeah, so McDonald was tattooing in the Jermyn Street baths, and he did rent the space to some degree, although he was also managing the bathhouse at the same time. So it's a bit difficult to kind of properly calculate that. But he says, well, someone says, and your charges, Mr. McDonald? Well, of course they depend, like the time occupied or the size and intricacy of the pattern to be tattooed. They range from 4 shillings or 5 shillings, for which I tattoo a simple monogram or crest, to as much as £20. And so the monogram, 4 shillings, is going to be about 40-50 quid, equivalent to today. And that £20 for a larger piece is going to be about £20. Sorry, that £20 is £3,000. So like a full back piece in the 1890s is about £3,000. And so that is about around about that time, like a week's work for a sort of minimum wage or sort of labouring job is about 200 quid. So that's basically equivalent of about 2 or 3 months' wages for someone working as a labourer. So again, I think that's probably not. I mean, he's at the high end, I suppose, but as you said, he's compared to today. But like that's $3 and a bit grand for a big old piece. And there's about 5 years later, he quotes someone asking how much a back piece costs, and he says it's £100. And £100 in 1897 is about £8,000 in modern money. And again, I think like that's rough. I mean, I know we're really talking a lot of different things, but like a back piece is probably not that far off from a lot of artists. About £8,000. The equivalent at the time, 300 days wages for a skilled tradesman, which is interesting, isn't it? That sort of changes the balance a little bit. It says you could buy 3 horses, 10. This is on the National Archives. With £100, you could buy 3 horses, 10 cows, or it was the equivalent of 300 days' wages. So, like, what's that? 8-9 months' wages, something like that. And that in purchasing power, that's a lot more than £8,000. That's pushing tens of thousands. So this is what I mean when these figures are very difficult to compare, because in strict inflation, we're looking at about £8,000, but in terms of purchasing power, it might be a lot more expensive.
And it creates this like interesting question then, is that like over time has the customers price elasticity of like what they're willing to pay for a tattoo just like hasn't changed? Or is it that the market factors for tattooing, although the dynamics have changed, the actual, I suppose, supply and demand of artists, customers has kind of remained constant, so therefore what people are willing to pay hasn't changed?
I think it is that. As I said, as we'll see as we go through, I think some of the lower end, like the starting prices for little bits of tattooing, probably is a bit more expensive now than it was.
Mm-hmm.
But the top end, I think you're right. The stability for that is because the number of people getting that level of coverage is probably, still fairly limited. And maybe not about the same. It's definitely more now than it was, but it's definitely.
Well, I mean, proportionally, it's probably the same.
Proportionally, yeah. So on that, so we're talking about between 40-50 quid for a little monogram. A quick sort of 20-minute job for McDonald up to about £8,000 for a back piece. His sort of greatest, the person to whom he was most usually compared was obviously Hori-Chiyo in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is really, really difficult to make comparisons. But basically, Hori-Chiyo had a reputation for being really expensive. Because I can
imagine, yeah.
Because he was the most famous tattooer in the world. Maybe he wasn't good, as we've talked about before in the show. Like, some of his rivals didn't think he was very good. But someone wrote into the Pall Mall Gazette in 1889, and they're talking about Hori-Chiyo. And then they say Hori-Chiyo is preeminent in his profession. He makes you pay through the nose for his artistic mutilations. In my case, says the correspondent, the operation lasted for nearly 2 hours. The pattern was a stork in flight, and the charge was 9 yen, equivalent to about 30 shillings. So 30 shillings is about 200, 300 quid. Mm-hmm. So he's charging 150 quid an hour. His services can be procured for 5 hours a day for 18 yen. So you can get a whole day rate for 500 quid. Again, really not that bad. And he told me he was once employed at Nico for 50 days in succession by 2 Americans whom he tattooed all over with the exception of the face and hands. And then the article says, this charge of 30 shillings, which the correspondent speaks of, is exorbitant and we should think unusual. To our own knowledge, similar operations have been performed for something like $2.50. So about half, which is about half the price. However, so Horichio, the best tattooer in the world at the time, is charging a sort of 500 quid day rate. Although I found this incredible thing. So Horichio was invited to come to America, and as various bits of research have shown, he never actually came. So the truth or otherwise of this may be questioned. But the story goes that this guy called Mr. Bandel, who was a millionaire in the late 19th century, invited Horichio to come to tattoo in America. And we know that some Japanese tattooists did come. And Horichio was offered an annual salary in 1890 odd of £2,400 in silver. This, however, he declined, saying he would not accept more than £2,400 in gold. Mr. Bandel seemed to have agreed to this and is soon taken to New York. It said that Horichio told one of his friends in jest that his getting such a high salary was entirely due to the kind efforts of the Yokohama police. Right? So the fact that tattooing was illegal in Japan meant that he was in demand in the US. And I did the sums, and again, it's very difficult because it also depends on the price of gold and all kinds of stuff. But that works out an annual salary of about £187,000 in today's money, which doesn't really chime with that £500 a day rate. So there's something fishy going on there. It may be just exaggeration. As I said, the whole story of Horichio coming to America is not true anyway. So who knows what's going on? But there were claims, at least, that Horichio in the 1890s was making the equivalent of nearly £200,000.
But it belies the point of there's a very clear international demand at the time, and you can already see the kind of the traveling artist kind of model coming into. It's if demand isn't there in a particular locality, or it's because of various different factors, you can just go somewhere else where the demand is and make money.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, at that time, there was a very, very small handful of tattooers that were able to make that kind of money. Just as an aside, around the same time in the US, so the other guy we should mention, Samuel O'Reilly, working in New York, again, someone that claimed a higher rent customer base, but really was tattooing a lot more rough clients than anyone in London was, certainly the McDonald was. And also at the time tattooing children and all kinds of things. So his rates, he said, range from 75 cents, which is about 30 quid, up to about $5, which is about 200 quid. So again, he's maybe doing bigger pieces occasionally, but he's bashing out a couple of things here and there.
Well, what you see is kind of, obviously you had McDonald doing monograms and stuff, but you start to see with O'Reilly this kind of awareness that there is a kind of bottom end of the market that also needs to be serviced as well. Right.
And it's interesting that I think a lot of this talk about money, it's also clearly a way to try and attract a higher class client base, actually, right? To kind of talk about the exclusivity. And there are a few tattooers again around this time who are themselves very heavily tattooed, you and I have had these questions. I get these questions sometimes from journalists, how much do all your tattoos cost if you add them all up?
I don't want to think about it.
One guy, again, probably a customer of McDonald's, so it's hard to tell, in 1899 was asked how much his stuff was. He said his skin was worth £400 in 1899, which is equivalent of a bodysuit to be about 30 grand, which is a lot of money. And a little bit later on, Gus Wagner in 1915, so in the run up to World War One, was asked a similar question. He was very heavily tattooed, and he valued his bodysuit at about the equivalent of $25,000 to £25,000 today. And again, I wouldn't want to add up the amount of money that I've spent on tattooing, and of course, I have been very privileged and lucky that people have done me some wonderful favors and we've done some exchanges and things. But like that again, that doesn't feel like a bad number for someone with a bodysuit today, between 25 and 30 grand, right? And it's 100 odd years ago.
Yeah, and then I suppose the next step, would be to jump forward in time a little bit to like look at the Pike, look at like Burt Grimm.
Right.
Like we obviously, as we move forward in time, we're going to have a lot more evidence of what people were charging. But I think this is the next place we need to go.
Yeah, well, so if we look 20s and 30s, which is slightly before that, the 20s and 30s seems to be, again, like there's an article about a woman who's got her shoulder tattooed with a little dragon thing, and that was quoted at $10, equivalent of about £200. Again, like, you know, an hour and a half's kind of tattoo, that kind of time. But you know, as what's happening into the 1920s is that tattooing is getting a bit less popular than it had been before, right? Tattooing is waning off. McDonald himself is writing in letters to friends at the time that tattooing is becoming less popular. And
once
there are
again,
a couple of examples.
Once again, to bring it up as well, like we're seeing that price elasticity of the customer kind of wane with market demand. It's like, if people don't really want tattoos anymore, the people who do want tattoos, you have to make a choice. Do you price yourself down and lower your prices in the hopes of attracting more people? Or do you focus on that core customer base of people who want tattoos and charge them a premium for it?
Right. So, you know, as I said, Gus Wagner says that he's charging about $35 to $60. So, you know, up to nearly $1,000. But then we get, after the Wall Street crash into the 30s, this is this article that I was alluding to a second ago about different prices. Quote, "Did you know that prices on the East Coast are cheaper than on the West Coast? A tattoo will cost you 75 cents in New York or Norfolk, will cost you $2.50 in Los Angeles or San Francisco. When the fleet moved into the Pacific, the Eastern Ink Boys never quite recovered from the shock." Actually, sorry, that's a bit late. It must be the 40s, that. So, you know, that's at a time when there are 200 or 300 tattooers in the United States, and, you know, 75 cents in the 40s is let me just quickly work that out. 75 cents in the 40s is about $15-$20, right?
Mm-hmm.
And $2.50 is
about
$80, yeah. But about $60-$70. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you've got this really interesting kind of market segmentation, if you like. Sorry, there's a slightly earlier one that I think is also really worth mentioning because it's hilarious. It's not just the segmentation, but it's also like why you want to get tattooed and how much you're willing to spend. And there's a story which made me laugh so much, which was about someone who wanted to get tattooed for revenge. This man came to me prepared to spend $50 if necessary to have his scheme put through. He picked out a huge snake to be worked from his shoulder to his wrist. The head of the snake was to be the head of a woman whose photograph he brought with him, and he wanted the tongue to have it forked. I worked the snake into him myself, but the head, he said, wanted to be put on by hand because he imagined the likeness could be done more accurate. So this guy wanted to do a kind of like, I hate this woman tattoo, and was spending again nearly $2,000 in 1901.
But it like, I think once again, and I suppose it's our big line with this show, is that like it's interconnected with everything. And if you look at the westward economic movement in the US in the 1920s coming up to the Wall Street crash, this makes sense that they're charging a little bit more. There's kind of quote unquote new money people out on the West Coast due to like stuff like oil drilling, new commerce, westward expansion, and you go where the money is.
Right. And as you said, as demand increases, like so do prices. So this is from the 1940s. This is Cap Coleman, speaking of Norfolk. In a modest shop window of the studio, I displayed scores of designs ranging from intricate Japanese dragons and American battleships in 5 colors designed for chess pieces, which cost all the way from $50 to $100 and can consume 4 or 5 hours to execute, down to small daggers through bleeding hearts that can be etched upon a forearm for a few minutes and cost only a couple of bucks. And so again, like a chess piece there, I mean, it's being produced probably quicker than you would do now. I mean, there are artists today that can bash out a chess piece in 5 hours, but that's like $25 an hour, or the equivalent for that chess piece of about $1,000, again, about £1,000, which is, I think, probably about what a chess piece would been run in some places these days, right? And that's in the early 1940s.
Mm-hmm. And as well, like you have to think of along with the kind of economic factors of like inflation, increase in wages, that sort of thing, you also have like increasing complexity over the preceding 40 years of tattooing in general. It's like there's more colors. It's like the electrification of tattooing is much more ubiquitous. People are able to do more with less time, but also like that's reflected in the prices as well.
Right. How much do you reckon the day rate was in Ireland for tattooing in 1895?
1895, I'm going to say like
equivalent to today's money.
2 shillings, which would probably equate to maybe like €80.
No, 400. One
Wow.
Irish guy says he's doing a 400 quid equivalent day rate, which is pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, 1890s in Ireland's not a really, really good time to be around. I'm not going to lie. We did have a population decrease of about half the country for reasons in the 1840s. So, not a whole lot of people with money in the 1890s.
Yeah. The Irishman gained his living as a tattooer. Sometimes earns as much as £5 a day. I think he had moved, actually, to be fair, he'd moved to New York rather than staying in Ireland. So this is this article from then moving forward from where we were in the 40s. This is this article that I quoted from a bit already of data collected by Andrew Leames, the customer of Ed Hardy's, who was trying to write this encyclopedia. He says, quote, in 1977, in the earlier days, 50 years ago, considering costs to the consumer, Charlie Wagner in 1926 said he charged what he could get, as much as $35 to $60 for large areas, which he called tableau art. Modest science designs that cost $2 to $5 dropped in the 1933 Depression years to 2 to 4 bits per design, right? So that's a kind of, I don't know how much a bit would be, but that's clearly a big drop. 1937 price list ran: chess piece $10, beauty spot $1.50, nude women $10, mermaids $2, hula dancer $1.50, snake woman $4, 1 foot square large design $8. American sailors and plebeians wanted a big splash, large size, not quality. In 1942, the average design, oh, this is so funny. In 1942, the average design, which took 10 minutes to half an hour, cost 25 cents to $5. In 1950, a full body Japanese pattern cost in Tokyo $80 or 30,000 yen, but few had the yen for one. Today, 27 years later, due partly to inflation and devaluation of the dollar, a different picture is presented. Top flight artists are now charging $50 to $60 an hour for custom work. Designs that cost $5 to $10 back in 1950 and now going for 3 to 4 times that amount. So, I mean, again, to sort of belabor that point, right? Like $60 an hour in 1977 is the equivalent of about $300 an hour today, right? And that's, well, I mean, bear in mind, we know who Leames was getting his data from. He was asking the best tattooers in the world at the time. He was getting tattooed by Ed Hardy and getting data from people like Cliff Raven and stuff. And then, as we mentioned on that episode, they got really pissed off at him for trying to reveal this information.
Yeah.
But again, like, I don't know how much the best tattooers in the world are charging now, but I'm sure some of them are probably around $300 an hour. Some of them are probably a bit more than that, but like,
and
that's
also
50 years ago.
It also depends on like locality, even country to country. Like tattooing in the US is like so much more expensive than it is in the UK. But similarly, like if you go to somewhere like Spain or Italy, like it might be cheaper because of externalities that influence like the market outside of tattooing.
100%. 100%. So, as you said, what happens in the 70s is tattooing gets much more popular, and that does come with a decrease. Now, this is another data point that I found, and it doesn't sound right to me. There was discussions around the time when tattooing was going to be banned in England in 1969 in Parliament, and one of the arguments that the government were trying to make at the time about banning tattooing was that it was costing the NHS too much money to remove tattoos, and there was even into the 90s, like there was an attempted bill that was going to be brought into Parliament, which Lal Hardy, amongst others, lobbied against. But there was going to be a bill saying if you wanted to be a professional tattoo artist, you had to have insurance that would pay for your customers to get their tattoo removed if they wanted it removed.
Mm-hmm. Once again, thank you, Lal Hardy.
That was in 92, that bill, or that proposal. But anyway, in 69, they're arguing about how much tattoo, about banning tattoos and how much removing tattoos cost and all this kind of stuff. Now, about 10 years earlier, Alex Gordon, who was a tattooer called Harry Battle, and Leslie Burchett, George Burchett's son, were charging about £5 for a tattoo, all the way up, which is up between £180 all the way up to about £1,000 for work. But then just a decade and a half later, it's quoted in Parliament that to get a back piece done would only cost £10, which I don't think that's right. Like that doesn't seem plausible to me. That the average price for they specifically talked about this back piece, which is very famous on the back of a member of the House of Lords, a kind of Fox and Hounds scene, and they said such a piece would cost about £10 today. Now, probably there were scratches around, but I don't reckon anyone was doing huge back pieces in 1969 for £10. Like that seems
that just seems like the kind of superlative that just seems like the superlative that would be said in Parliament to be shocking. Like, oh, you could, for as little as £10, you can get this, and that, like, the children can get them, and
yeah, that probably is it. And the amount of, and obviously that then the comparative price to remove them would be a huge amount, a lot more. In the US in the 70s, we've got is an interesting article with Spiderweb, who's this kind of, again, quite famous tattooer who we'll do an episode about at some point, who was kind of doing conceptual art tattooing and stuff. He said, I'm very famous, and sometimes it's a drag. Sometimes you want to be left alone. People want me to sign their skin, which is a great ego trip. There are no set prices at the studio. I'm just like Robin Hood. I try to be fair. I look at the estate and I take what's fair. Webb said he's done many tattoos for free, but the most expensive one was $100,000. It was a full bodysuit from neck to foot of interlocking flowers. And so, and again, $100,000 in the late 70s is going to be a hell of a lot of money, right? Like,
it's probably about 520,000.
No, apparently, according to my inflation calculator, it's about £500,000.
Yeah, that's what I said. 520,000.
Oh, did you? Sorry, I thought you said 120,000.
Oh, yeah, no.
You're good. 520 is almost exactly.
I did study economics for 4 years, so I am good at this.
Again, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But again, I reckon there probably are tattooers at the level of fame and artistic self-importance of McDonald, of Webb, who would be charging him that amount.
But it also, as well, is it acts not just as a tattoo, but in that particular case, it probably was done as a conceptual art piece that stands alone from just being a tattoo. Not saying the tattoos aren't art, before anyone gets mad at me.
Okay, so now we really are in Ireland in the 80s.
Mr. Johnny Eagle, here we go.
Actually,
Kung Fu,
it's a guy
baby.
called this is a guy from Dublin who I'd not heard of before, but whose name is Brendan Hart with an E.
I've heard that name before.
He was charging between £500 and £200. So £200 in 1985 is what today? Or actually, this calculator's only goes to 2017, so it'll be a bit more. But yeah, roughly what is that?
What was the number again?
£200.
In 1980s, £200, approximately. It's about 4,700.
No, I think you're way off there. The calculator says £200 in 2017 was about £550.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I'm brain fried.
You were an order of magnitude out. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Probably about 700 quid, I would guess then today. So again, like, and that, and that's a kind of pretty standard, pretty kind of not, nondescript, normal shop in Ireland in the mid 80s. Which again I thought was interesting, right? Okay, here's there was a tattoo in Scotland at the same time doing the same prices. At the same time, this made me laugh. 1986. There's some flash for sale by Graham Townsend, but signed as if drawn by Ron Ackers because he was claiming to have drawn it, but by Graham Townsend. How much was a flash set in 1986?
How many sheets?
That's a good question. I don't know actually if I wrote that down. I think it was four sheets, I think.
4 sheets, 1987, yeah?
And 86.
86. I'm going to say, £100?
Correct. You're good at this. You're very good at this. So bear in mind, again, comparatively, so around the same time, well, a little bit later, 1989, needles were 16 quid for 12. Is that right? New prices: Eyeless 12, £16.10. I don't know what the quantity is there. 1.5 pound of pigment, which you'd have to mix yourself, was 12 quid. Magenta. So white ink was 1.5 pounds in weight for £12 in cash. Magenta, £32 for half a pound in weight. So like purple and violet inks in the 80s were way more expensive. Even into like nearly the even the early 90s.
Yeah.
You're paying more. Well, my maths is not agile enough, but you're paying 12 quid for 1.5 pounds of white, but 32 quid for half a pound of magenta. Like absolutely bonkers.
It's really funny because I was having a conversation with someone a while ago about powdered inks, and there's someone who's been tattooing for a long time, and they said that powdered inks were great because there was so much less wastage than like pouring it into like from a bottle, because once you can like measure out the powder more accurately than just the bottle.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there are lots of discussions throughout here about tattooers, the ways they save money, not reusing or reusing needles, for example. It's a nice way. You're advised sometimes, in these early days, that reusing needles is a good way to save cash. I've had a nice quote that in the 1970s, a bodysuit in Japan cost as much as a mink coat, although it didn't say exactly what that number was.
Mm-hmm. Also, as well, if you're listening and you're someone who listens and is listening to this episode who's been tattooing for quite a long time, maybe from the 80s or 90s onwards, please give us a message on Instagram and let us know, like, what you were charging for a palm-sized tattoo or like a chest piece or a back piece. We both would absolutely love to hear from you. It's Beneath Skin Pod.
For sure. I reckon, so I reckon, to sort of sum up as we come to the end, I reckon, like, as I said, the lower end is more expensive now, because there were people busting out little tattoos for 20, 30, 40 quid. I mean, maybe there still are actually, all the way through, equivalent. But the top end, people have been doing bodysuits of back pieces for 8, 10, 30, 100 grand, again, for a very, very long time. Equipment seems to have got cheaper, weirdly.
That's probably due to mass manufacturing more than anything.
100%. 100%. So those Gamages machines that we talked about, like, although we've mentioned that they were sort of for sale in in things that look like toy shops in 1911, they were
I have the price right here.
85 shillings. Yeah, that's 5 shillings and 6 pence.
Oh, sorry, 52 6 pence. 52 and 6 pence.
Oh, so £52 and 6 shillings. So
then the multi-coil one that famously used by George Burchett, it was £85.
Yeah, I think that must be 85 shillings because 85
85
pounds
shillings.
is way too much.
And then the regular, coil machine that is still the basis of most tattooing now was 18 shillings and 9 pence.
1 pound, 18 shillings and 9 pence was 114 pounds. But yeah, 84 shillings. What's that in pounds? 84 shillings. I think I worked out for about 450 quid, which again actually probably isn't that. Maybe that isn't that different.
But like I said, I think in terms of like supplies, obviously like the huge difference is the mass manufacturing and like machines that are made with like, with the guards on them with like CNC press, that sort of thing. Like obviously there was the middle period where the vast majority of machines were probably more bespoke made. So, and more personalized, so demanded a higher price. But now if you're just like, you're buying a rotary machine that comes like pre-packaged, it kind of evens out the market.
Right. Yeah. So, hold on. There we go. Right. It's about £4. There we go. Yeah. So those machines are there's 20 shillings to a pound. So that's about 300 quid, something like that. So yeah, I don't know. I think I wonder if so I've been looking at these numbers. I haven't looked at them, and again, I'm not going to claim that was systematic. But I have been looking at these numbers over a long time, just kind of thinking about, just as I've been reading articles, and when I did sort of occasionally do these conversions, it was like, oh, actually, that's kind of roughly what tattoos cost now. At the certainly the kind of tattoos that I get and see my friends getting at good shops in big metropolitan centers in the Western world. So I don't know, I think maybe that's surprising to people.
Yeah, I think like it's interesting in the sense that tattooing for, I suppose, the majority of the 20th century was serving like very particular markets and like operating around ports in big metropolitan cities. So when you're in ports, you have sailors who you kind of know how much they're being paid, so you can base your kind of prices off that. And then metropolitan cities, you're appealing to a variety of price points, whereas now I think it's harder for an artist to judge what's affordable to people.
Yeah, I suppose so. And I guess, I mean, it also depends, of course, like how much you're charging is one thing, but then it's also how busy you are, right? Like,
yeah.
It's okay to charge X amount of money per tattoo, but it also depends on how many tattoos a year you're doing. I didn't find a lot of data on that question, but I did find the one article I did find that mentioned it was an article about Leslie Scouse, not Leslie Scouse, Bill Scouse and Rusty Scouse in Aldershot in the mid 70s, and it was said that they annually did about £4,000 worth of tattooing, which is the equivalent of probably about 40 grand today. And again, between two of you, like in terms of just revenue rather than profit, that's not a lot.
Yeah.
Although it was sort of presented in the article as if it was, so it's again difficult to know how to combine that. And again,
well, I think as well. When you look at like inflation rates and price comparisons of like the actual purchasing power of that amount of money probably went a lot further back then, because obviously the rate of wage inflation versus like the consumer price index of the cost of things doesn't match up. So like things comparatively back then were cheaper than they are now for you to buy for the same amount of money.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, so I'm looking at this the National Archives currency converter, and it does say £4,000 in 1975 is worth approximately £30,000 in 2017. But then it also says that's the equivalent of 69 days' wages of a skilled tradesman, and that's definitely not true, right? Like
tattooing, famously a cash-based business.
Yeah, but also like there's no way, like if that's 69 days' wages, 30 grand. There's four grand equivalent of 30 grand. That's an insanely high salary that doesn't seem to be correct to me. So I don't know. As I said, this is very difficult. It requires much more contextual analysis. I will also
say when it's a cash-based business, it's not really good to accurately represent your cash-based earnings to an interview, because the tax man will come to your door.
Yeah, and there have been tattooers, who have got in a lot of trouble for not paying their tax bills.
If you're interested in
And
that,
it's
listen
funny-
to our episode about with the tattoo accountants.
Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, that's also. I mean, this is a good place to end. Like, there is clearly a kind of there is incentive here to not talk about how cheap you are, right? No tattooer ever, as far as I can tell, in the articles that I've read, have been saying, "Come and get tattooed by me. It's cheap." They've all been saying you can start off with a little banger for an affordable price, but I will tattoo big and expensive if you want me to. That's the way that tattooers market themselves. But because you don't want to be the guy that undercuts everyone else. But at the same time, as you said, there is also this countervailing pressure to not boast too much about how much you're earning, because that attracts the wrong kind of attention.
But now we're seeing like the complete inverse of that, where people are, because now there is a lot of tattooers, people are competing on price alone. Like I've seen day rates in the north of England for like £150, and people are, they're competing on price because it's like there's 2 other tattoo studios like nearby. Someone will just go to them. So what have I got to compete on?
Yeah, and
is
I heard
price.
that. I heard that too, with people saying that younger tattooers, who obviously haven't got families and mortgages, often are also doing that. But I mean, yeah. I was really surprised, Tom, at just how static all this was. But part of me wonders if, like, one of the reasons is that a middle class wages are a middle class wage in terms of purchasing power, if nothing else, right? More or less. I mean, that's a very blanket statement to say, and there's huge complexity to that as a statement. But one of the things we have talked about as well before is that tattooing as a business is not that scalable, because tattooers can only tattoo X number of hours per day. And if you're charging X per hour or X per day, you can't get any busier than your maximum capacity. And so, and there is this kind of, especially when there are more tattooers around, there is a kind of maximum price you can charge most of the time. That actually, the fact that you're aiming for a certain kind of salary level, based on the amount of hours that you're able to work in a day or a week, like, maybe that's not a surprise that has stayed static. I mean, that's, again, without any economics training or just off the top of my head, and there's lots of moving parts to that equation, but that feels to me perhaps one of the reasons why this stability stayed fixed, right? I don't know. That feels, again, I'd have to speak to someone who knows more about economics than I do and could do this historical and economic analysis. But I would guess that, if you're aiming for a certain, middle class standard of living, in terms of purchasing power, you've only got X number of hours in the day. You're going to be charging X amount per hour.
Well, I think the thing is that when you look at it, like, the core demographic of most tattooers is people probably between, like, under the age of 35, maybe 40. By the time someone reaches 40, they've probably gotten most of the tattoos that they have already gotten. And, like, the real potential earning level of the core of their customer base is relatively, well, not static. It's actually shrinking. Like, the comparative levels of wages for people under the age of 35 have actually shrank over the past 40 years. So if the vast majority of people who are your core customer base have relatively lower purchasing power than they did before due to inflation, wage stagnation, rising living costs, you can't charge more, pretty much. So
no,
it's like,
your salary or your charging is going to be relative to the economic prosperity or otherwise of your customer base. Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's always going to be linked. I think also, I mean, again, to hammer that point home, right, that actually tattoos are like big, good tattoos are expensive, and so they are a luxury good of a kind, right? And so, the amount that they cost is always going to be relative in some degree to the purchasing power of a certain moneyed kind of person at a moneyed stage in their life. So,
well, like, the thing is
more analysis to be done.
Well, the thing is that, like, you only really reach the maturation of your earning potential in your, like, mid to late 40s, early 50s, and by that time, nowadays, most people, like, have mortgages, have kids. So once it's like you reach that point where you're kind of aging out of the core demographic for the bulk of tattooers' business, which is younger than 35, your money's spent elsewhere. It's spent on the mortgage, kids, housing, college funds, cetera, et cetera. So like the financial responsibilities when someone is like earning more and more and more and has, in a technical sense, more money to spend on tattooing, they don't, because they just have to spend more money or more of their money in other places.
Yeah, and I'd be interested that someone, again, more skilled with historical economics than me, could do some really interesting contextual analysis on that if we can work something out, because it's such a difficult set of questions to ask. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should leave the final word, right? And we've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I think it's a good place to finish. The final word on how much tattoos cost to Charlie Dick, of how much he was charging when he was tattooing in a prisoner of war camp in occupied Poland. Without access to cash, I'm quoting myself here from Painted People. Without access to cash, he advertised a price list which offered to trade tattoos for rations. A name, 3 cigarettes. Name with a scroll, 10 cigarettes. Swallow, 15 cigarettes. Eagle and snake, 1 loaf of ration bread. Chest piece, 1 ounce pack of tobacco and half a loaf of ration bread. Back piece, 2 loaves and 50 cigarettes. The Bible would have been very different if that was what Jesus gave to the 5,000. 2 loaves and 50 facts. Bring back bartering for tattooing. Actually, I know some people do that, actually, and lots of tattooers I know trade plumbing and electricity and lectures at their shop sometimes for tattoos. But I like that. But a back piece for 2 loaves and 50 cigarettes seems like a phenomenal deal. I'd rather that than the 200 grand it's going to cost me to get one from Horichio.
Yeah, there you go. But it's very, very interesting journey, and it's probably not what people thought. If you asked them this, is like, do you think tattoos are more expensive now than they were 120 years ago? They probably would have said no, or said, yeah, they're definitely more expensive. But here we go.
Yeah, and I said, look, this is only a survey of the people who are famous enough to get their tattoos in the newspapers. So I'm sure there's other kind of data points that we can look at to find out what was happening at the lower end of the market. But certainly at the upper end of the market, it seems to me that a good tattoo is, somewhere equivalent to about 150 quid an hour, and a day rate is somewhere between 500 and a grand a day.
Yeah. And with that, it's a thank you for me. I want to thank some other people as well: Roy Hoxema, Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Charlie Lightning, Shit Jesus, Seb Lewis, Rowe, Reed Forden, Kirsten Wright, Kevin Fish, Kathleen Burkhardt, James Schick, Edub, Dylan, Casey Wardell, Calistelos Reos, and Becky Gorgon. Thank you very much to all of you. As always, links to all the usual stuff are downstairs in the description of this episode. It's links to our Instagram, web shop, Matt's new book. And with that out of the way, it's thank you and goodbye from me.
And thank you and goodbye from me. And thank you additionally from me to all of our amazing patrons, particularly the £15 ones. And we've met a couple of you recently, both Tom and I, and we really, it's a really amazing thing. So thank you. And have a good rest of your day.
Bye.